Welcome back. Today we are going to be covering Lab 5, and we are now getting into the introduction of the skeleton. This section, Lab 5 and Lab 6, are usually the ones where a lot of my students have a lot of difficulties. And for the most part, it's because of the amount of memorization that needs to happen. I'm going to be honest with you all. Memorizing the bones of the body, the skeleton, can seem a little difficult and challenging. It's why the videos are broken up into two. It's broken up into two because I recorded them previously, and it was when I was teaching live, and I didn't want to re-record them, but I do break them in two because I also want you guys to take a break in between learning the bones of the body. So definitely, watch Lab 5 all in one sitting, totally fine. But when you do get to the Lab 6 video, I highly recommend really just taking a minute, 5, 10, 15 minutes a day in between the two videos, because I don't want you to feel overwhelmed, right? Because essentially you are learning the entire skeleton of the body in a week, and you're going to be tested on it at the end of the week. So it is very, very intimidating, but I don't want to discourage you. I really don't want to discourage you, because in actuality, in reality, the skeleton is a very easy thing to memorize. It is so easy, because you just have to think of the bone and what is the function and purpose of the bone. You can see a bone and say that looks like it does what, and then try and find it on your body. It's so simple. It's very, very easy. And again, my students always tell me, but Professor, you're the professor, that's why you find it easy. And this is where I answer my students and say, I'm going to be straight and honest with you guys. The first time I taught Anthro Lab, I didn't have my bones memorized at all. And I learned them. I memorized them along with my students. And I would pick up a bone, I'd look at it, and I'd just kind of look at my notes and be like, what bone is this? But eventually, I figured it out. And, it might have been after my students took their quiz and their final, but I did figure it out. I just want to say, just take it easy. And I'm telling you this now in the Lab 5 section, knowing that Lab 6 is the actual memorization of the bones. But I really just want you guys to, one, understand it is a hard section. And two, understand that it's just a lot more intimidating than it actually is. And in actuality, it's not that hard. So again, this section is where a lot of my students have a hard time. The other section, which will be coming up in a few weeks, is the taxonomy and breakdown of primates. That's just another one that my students have a hard time with, and most students do. So don't feel discouraged if you find this section to be extremely difficult. I understand the difficulty of it. Just give it your best, and just really just watch the videos, and really and what I want you to do is, as I go through, not this lab, but the next lab, I'm prefacing everything now, and I'll repeat it in the next video. As I go through the labs and I'm talking about bones and where they're at in our body, you need to touch your frontal bone, your humerus, your tibia, your fibia, your femur. Touch those bones and really familiarize yourself with them by touch, right? And to be able to visualize them, see them, and feel them. Really do that, because it really, really, really helps. And every single one of my students who does well on this section tells me that was key to them memorizing the bones. So that's it for my preface for Lab 5. I will jump right into the lab. And again, there's a lot to learn in this lab, but again, it is not as hard as you think it might be, or as students think it is, right? Usually in my class, I don't want to sound like a bummer, but this is where I lose quite a few students, because they think it's it's so hard and it's only going to get harder. It doesn't. It's very easy. Everything is foundational. You build upon the last thing you learned, right? So the skeleton is going to keep coming up, right? Because I'm going to talk about things, in primates, and in our evolutionary lineage, and it's going to make sense because it's going to come back to these sections. So the first thing and the first part that we're going to talk about is the function of bones and, how bones are made. And that's going to come back when we're doing, forensics, right? So just remember, everything builds upon everything in this lab. So the first section, again, is introduction to the skeleton. So what do we need to know about the skeleton and directional terminology? That's the main part. So the function of bones. We have two key roles. Or bone plays two key roles in our body. It has a structural function and a physiological function, right? So structurally and physiologically, they have a function. So the structural function is that muscles attach to the bones and give them the structural support that they need. It also provides a system of levers that the muscles can use to move the body. It also acts as a protective structure for your organs. So an example is the ribs protecting the heart and the lungs, right? That is your structural function. Without that structural function, we'd be a bag of mushy flesh and muscle, right? That's it. We would have no structure. So again, it gives us structure. It acts as a lever system so we can move our muscles, right? Just think about it. If you work out, if you have ever, gone to the gym and you noticed, people working out muscle groups and things like that. And they say things like, you're working out your core, and you're like, what's your core, right? And then you might have to ask someone. I've had instructors or trainers be like, your core is everything in your abs, but it also runs down to your hamstrings. And that's just understanding. Like when you do leg lifts, you're using your core muscles. You're still using those muscles. So those muscles in your core, which we think of as our abs, are pulling on those levers of our femurs and pulling our legs upwards, right? That is how levers work. If you think, the easiest one to think about is your bicep, right? Your bicep muscle, everyone's familiar with your bicep, right? Or should be. It's it's that muscle you use when you flex and you're trying to flex your arm, right? That muscle goes from the very top of your humerus, right? But it extends past your humerus down to your radius ulna area, right? So past your elbow, essentially, but the armpit side of your elbow, right? There's an actual technical anatomical word for it, but I forgot it right now. It extends past that. And when you contract that muscle, it pulls on the forearm and it brings, say, your fist upwards to your chin, right? It brings it upwards. And so what it's doing is your muscle is pulling on this other bone, and that lever system is pulling your arm upwards. That's what we mean, is that it serves a structural function as a system of levers that the muscles can then use to move the body. So structural support they need, system of levers to move the body, and a protective structure to protect our organs, right? Ribs protecting heart and lungs, cranium protecting the brain, and pelvis protecting your pelvic organs and all that stuff. So structural function. The physiological function is that the skeleton is an essential part of the normal and healthy functioning of the body. How so? Inside the bones, there is bone marrow, right? There are two types of bone marrow, red marrow, yellow marrow, and no, that is not a tongue twister to warm up your mouth, right? The red marrow, yellow marrow. So red marrow is capable of producing blood cells for the rest of the body. Yellow marrow is mostly made up of fat cells. And so the amount that we have of yellow marrow increases as adults age. So yellow marrow produces fat, cartilage, and bone. The other thing is that bone stores important nutrients, right? Particularly calcium and phosphorus. So when these nutrients are needed anywhere else in our body, they can be released from the bones and sent wherever it is necessary. So by producing blood cells and storing fat and key nutrients, the skeleton plays a vital role in supporting the overall health of the body. So let's get into it. So bone and cartilage are two types of connective tissue, right? Connective tissue is just tissue that connects. You'd be surprised what, bone and cartilage being connective tissue, right? I think blood is also considered a connective tissue. It's been a couple of years since I took anatomy, but bone and cartilage are two types of connective tissue. Connective tissue is made up of cells, right? Mostly elastic collagen fibers and extracellular matrix. I think blood is the exception. Cartilage is a flexible connective tissue due to its abundance of collagen fibers, but it has no direct blood supply. So it's very important that we understand that it has no direct blood supply, and I'll explain, right? So cartilage is found in many parts of the human body, including the joints between our bones, the ears, the nose, and the bronchial tubes in the airways. In an embryo, the skeleton is made up mostly or almost entirely of cartilage that is replaced by bone tissue during growth and development. Once the growth period is completed, most of our cartilage in the skeleton is replaced by bone, except for the few places where it is retained into adulthood. So we're thinking like the rib cage, right? We need cartilage there to allow for that flexibility of the rib cage to move, right? And the joints. We need it in our joints to help with movement and cushioning blows. One thing, what I said, it's important that we understand that it has no direct blood supply. It's just kind of a fun fact, right? Because I'm not going to test you on it. But cartilage has no blood supply. So when damage is sustained at in the cartilaginous areas, like your ear, your nose, like severe traumatic damage where say your ear, a chunk of it is ripped off, it's not going to grow back. Right? It's not going to grow back because there is no direct blood supply to it. So the cartilage has no blood supply, and so some, severe traumatic damage happens. It's very difficult for it to be, not very difficult, there is reconstructive surgery, but it's difficult to get it back to what it originally was. So that's why botched nose jobs are so traumatic and so difficult to fix. Right? That's just an example I thought of. So next is that joints are articulations, right? And an articulation, all that it means is that this is a place where two bones meet or they articulate with one another, right? So we call the technological anatomical term for our joints is articulations. There are many different joints in the human body, and they are classified by their amount of movement and the type of tissue that connects them. Right? You've got fibrous joints, you've got cartilaginous joints, and you've got synovial joints. Those are the three main types of joints. So fibrous joints. Fibrous joints are united by short, irregular fibrous connective tissue, and they allow for little or no movement. So when I'm talking about these joints, and I ask you, like, if I were to ask you, like, the joints in your fingers are what kind of joints, or the joints in your cranium are what kind of joints, just think of the purpose of that area. Like, what is the ideal purpose? Do you want a lot of movement? Do you want very little movement? Do you want, no movement at all? And that's going to tell you what kind of joint it is. So fibrous joints, again, short, irregular, fibrous connective tissue, allow for little or no movement. So think, where on your body would you want little to no movement at all? But you still have bones articulating next to each other, so they are joints. So where do you have these kinds of joints? I'll give you a minute. You can answer it. I won't hear you. Just answer it. And I'm going to imagine that you answered and you said something like the suture joints between the flat skull bones, or in your cranium or in your head, right? And I'm going to say, yeah, correct, 100%, right? Fibrous joints, right? The joints in between your facial bones, think specifically your cranium, everywhere around your brain, right? Those are fibrous joints. You want no movement in those joints. I mean, there is some movement that can happen, but you really don't want any movement happening there. So fibrous joints. Then we have cartilaginous joints, and these are united by cartilage and permit a little movement, such as the joints there. So where do you want some movement, but not like a crazy amount of movement? You want you to guess? 2 seconds, right? Those joints, I'm going to imagine you said the spine, the vertebra, right? the joints between the vertebra and the spine, right? You got intervertebral discs. These are your cartilaginous joints. You want some movement, right? You want to be able to move your spine, right? Obviously, but you don't want a crazy amount of movement, right? So some movement. So our cartilaginous joints. Lastly is our synovial joints. Your synovial joints are the most mobile joints, and it allows for a variety of movements. So where can you have like crazy movements? And I mean, I'm doing the crazy movements right now, but you can't see me. But where do you have, or where do you want a crazy amount of movement? That is where you're going to have your synovial joints. Now pause for a second. Imagine that you said something like the knee, the shoulder, the hips, right? Your legs. Yes, those are your synovial joints. Your fingers, right? Synovial joints. What's interesting with our synovial joints is that the bones of the synovial joints are held together along their outer surfaces by ligaments and dense irregular connective tissue that then form an articular capsule around it. Unlike our fibrous and cartilaginous joints, synovial joints have a small gap. The joint space then between the articular surfaces of the bone, right? So if you think of our fingers, like when we crack our fingers, which I don't know if you heard that, I just did it, right? You're cracking those joints. What you have is you have two bones, the two articular surface, and they don't actually meet. And you'll see a picture in a little bit. I go over it with the knee, but the two bones, they don't actually touch each other, right? You have a space. In that space, right, in that gap, you have a slippery lubricant, which is known as synovial fluid, right? That synovial fluid flows into the joint space, and it helps healthy joints move easily. Key term there is healthy joints, right? Bone, though, is a lot different, right? Bone is a much more rigid connective tissue than cartilage, right? Our bones work together with many other systems in the body, such as the muscular system and the circulatory system. So approximately 1/3 of bone tissue is made up of organic components, and 2/3 is made up of inorganic components. So inorganic material is primarily your carbonated apatite, which is a mineral that is made up of calcium, phosphate, and fluoride. While then your inorganic components are important for the structural integrity of the bone, which is your collagen fibers, also then contributing significantly to the bone's strength and resilience. So with bone, there are two types of bone. There is woven bone and there is lamellar bone. Right? Woven bone is unorganized bone. It's primarily seen in your immature bone. Juvenile skeletons that are still growing have a lot of woven bone. However, adults can also have woven bone. It's not just reserved for juveniles. So in this case, right, where an adult would have a woven bone, it's if a person has a broken bone, they will have woven bone at the site of the injury, as the bone was then trying to fix itself and repair that break, right? So if your bone breaks, you will have, as it heals, you'll have woven bone starting to form, and then it slowly heals itself, right? Then you have lamellar bone, and lamellar bone is the mature bone. So an adult skeleton, when not injured or healing, is made up of lamellar bone, right? And we'll look at those. So here's the joint, right? And you can see again, this is between the femur and the tibia, right? Your knee. And you can see here, right? You have your bone. Here's your femur. Here's your tibia, right? And this is not the woven bone that I'm talking about. Don't get it confused, right? This is not woven bone, right? This is something else, and we're going to talk about it. So we have here our femur. We have our tibia, right? You have that space in between. In that space, which is your joint cavity, you have that synovial fluid. Our ligaments right here, creating that articular capsule. Here you have articular cartilage on the two sides of the bone, right? And I said, remember, we're going to talk about it. This is not woven bone. It's what we call trabecular bone, and here is cortical bone. Right? So very different. Don't get it confused with woven versus lamellar, right? So Now, let's go back to the skeletal system. So within the lamellar bone, there are two types of bone tissue, cortical and trabecular. Cortical bone is the compact tissue that makes up the outside of the bone, that hard kind of bone. This is what we think of as that solid and smooth area that we're imagining. Then we have our trabecular bone, and that is our spongy or honeycomb-like tissue, and it makes up the inside of the bone. This appears less solid and rougher than our cortical bone, but it's more metabolically active due to the greater amount of surface area in the honeycomb-like structure. And this is where your professor may gross you out. Maybe, not sure. But I want you to think about just if you've ever had like soups or, like sopa de res, right? And if you've ever gone, you've had like, my grandma makes sopa de res all the time, or not all the time, especially when it's hot though, she'll make it. But she makes sopa de res, and, they're always using those like big bone meats, right? Specifically, it's the shank meat if you're into cooking, because the bone gives off a lot of flavor, right? So, and again, I don't mean to gross anybody out, but because we're talking about the human skeletal system and all that stuff. But I want you to know that you have had experience with this kind of bone, understanding the differences, right? You've seen what cortical bone versus trabecular bone is. If you're, like me and you enjoy the bone in your soup, like you kind of like people who really like the bones in their soup will suck on it, and it just has that extra meaty flavor in it, that you're sucking out the juice, the broth that was made with, from that trabecular bone. You get none from your cortical bone, essentially. And don't mean to gross you guys out, and I apologize if I did gross you out, or if you're never able to think of, sopa de res the same way again. But essentially that's what it is that trabecular bone, right? That's where all the juicy yumminess comes out of. All right, enough of grossing you out. Cortical bone versus trabecular bone. We'll see a picture in a little bit. But the last thing, or not the last thing, but one thing we need to know, another thing we need to know is that there are three main types of bone cells, right? So we've talked about the two types of bone, woven and lamellar. We've talked about, within the lamellar, there's two types of bone tissue, right? Cortical and trabecular. Now we're talking about the cells. So there are three main types of bone cells. We have osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts, right? Osteoblasts are responsible for forming bone. Osteocytes are responsible for bone maintenance, and osteoclasts are responsible for removing bone, right? So these three bone cells work together in a constant process called bone remodeling. And we'll go over that really quick, looking at the cortical versus trabecular bone, right? Cortical, again, the outside, trabecular, that inside honeycomb-like bone. Okay, so bone remodeling. Our bones are constantly reabsorbed and resorbed and reformed all the time. Approximately every 10 years, our skeleton is completely replaced by brand new bone tissue. So bone remodeling is that process of bone resorption and reformation. The osteoclast bone comes in and it removes and resorbs the bone, right? I think of the osteoclast as kind of like those like steel wool sponges that kind of come in and they just kind of scrub it all away and they just kind of eat at it, right? The osteoclast bone cells, they're large, multiple nuclei. They remove, resorb the bone like a scrubbing pad, like those steel wool scouring pads. They just kind of go in. I mean, I think they like put out enzymes and that's how they do it and all that stuff. But essentially, they essentially remove and resorb that bone. Then your osteoblasts come in, right? The blasts in anatomy, osteo always means bone. Blast means like immature. Cyte means cell, right? Trying to think of a word. I can't think of the word. It's not going to come to me anytime soon. But cyte means cell. Cytology is like the study of cells, right? Something like that. But blast is immature. So the osteoblasts become trapped in the bone tissue as it mineralizes, right? So osteoclasts come in, resorb the bone, right? The blasts come in, osteoblasts, they come in and they're trapped by the bone tissue. As it mineralizes, then they become your osteocyte bone cells. So the osteocytes are the living bone cells that are then left responsible for maintaining the bone tissue, right? There's many reasons why this process exists, right? Growth and development, extraction of important nutrients, repairing damage, meeting the functional and biomechanical challenges of the bone. And I'm going to go through each one of those reasons. Really quick though, here's an example, right? Your osteoclasts come in, they kind of look like little scrub pads right here, right? And they're just eating away at the bone, right? They create this like dip. Here, your osteoblasts, your immature cells come in, they get trapped, right? They're going through mineralization, right? They mineralize, and then if you look at here, now you have your osteocytes, and they're all forming right down here. And you go through this process over and over and over again, and every 10 years you get a brand new skeleton, right? So first reason, bone remodeling, right? Growth and development. As we age, our skeletons need to grow. So many osteoblasts will lay down tissue to allow for this expansion and growth of bones, right? Extracting important nutrients. Bone remodels to extract nutrients from the body. So bones, we know, store nutrients like calcium and phosphorus when they're needed elsewhere in the body. Bone remodeling will begin. Tiny gaps are removed from the bone to release trapped nutrients, and then the tiny gaps are filled in and the body is built back up, right? The third reason, repairing damage. It can be large-scale damage, like a bone fracture, but even if you've never had a fracture, your skeleton is still full of small-scale micro damage from daily use. If these minor damages go unrepaired, it can lead to much worse damage, right? It can decrease the strength and the health of the bone, right? Sometimes you might injure your bone and you might not even know it. I have, and it causes, again, long-term issues. For me, I fractured my foot years ago. Never realized I fractured my foot. Just kind of, I don't know, I never noticed it. I never realized it. And then I started working out more. I specifically started running, and I started getting pain in my foot, and I didn't know why. Like, why was I getting pain? Specifically, that pain happens. It's in my tarsal bones. So I think it's in my navicular specifically. It'll make more sense when we talk about bones. But I haven't looked at the x-ray, although I can. But I went to the doctor. I asked, and I told her, I was like, hey, like my foot really hurts specifically when I work out. I don't know what's going on. It's just suddenly happened. She said, okay, we'll order you x-rays. Went same day, got the x-rays done. She called me like 2 days later and said, yeah, I was looking at your x-rays, and it seems like you fractured your foot a while ago, and it just never healed properly. It's not healed. It's not properly healed, and it's going to be chronic pain. You're always going to have this problem. So she said, I suggest you just get a wrap, you support your foot, your ankle, and you can continue working out on stuff. And so that's what I do. Like I do normal workouts on stuff, but when I feel my foot starting to hurt, because again, I'm causing more damage to that bone area because I don't listen, then I put my wrap on my ankle and my foot, and I endure that pain. But don't be like the professor. Take care of your bones, right? Let those small-scale micro damages heal, right? Shin splints are kind of the same thing, right? It's micro damage, micro fractures to your tibia, right? And that's why you're feeling shin splints. Got off topic. Repairing damage. Next is meeting the functional and biomechanical needs and challenges of the bone, right? Use it or lose it, essentially. If you use a part of your body a lot, the muscles in that area will grow larger. So when you have larger muscles, you need larger bones for their attachment. So when you use a body part a lot, the corresponding muscles and bone grow bigger. At the same time, if you don't use your body part enough, the muscles in that area will become smaller. When you have smaller muscles, there's less bone needed for their attachment. When you don't use the body part enough, then you lose that muscle and you lose that bone mass, right? Less muscle and bone mass is lost. So bone remodel also drives this bone loss. So I'll give you a very, very simple example. I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to imagine you guys are responding to me as I record this lecture, but have you ever gone to get like rings or ring sizes, right? And you imagine maybe you have, maybe you haven't, right? If you've ever gone to get a ring, right, or you buy a ring and you're thinking it's going to fit you, right, and you put it on, and it fits one hand, it fits one hand on one side, but say you don't want it on your left hand, maybe you want it on your right hand, right, and you try and put it on the same finger of your right hand, and you realize that it's bigger, right, I'm going to say, if you take a ring from your left hand, say from your middle finger, and try to put it on your right hand, middle finger, and the ring is too big, I am going to, my hypothesis, educated guess, is that you are a lefty, right? If the ring you take from your middle finger on your left hand and you put it on your right hand and it is bigger on your right hand, I am going to say you are a lefty. If you take the ring from your right hand and you put it on your left hand and it is bigger, my hypothetical or my hypothesis, my educated guess is that you are a righty, right? This is because it goes back to this use it or lose it. Why can I make this hypothetical or this hypothesis and be, I want to wager 99% correct, is because of that use it or lose it function, right? Your ring sizes are slightly larger on the hand you write with because you use that hand more frequently. Right? So just think of like writing. When you write, you're using those muscles so much more. I mean, I don't know how much you guys write now, but you're using those muscles a lot more. So more muscles, bigger bone, bigger fingers, right? Another example, athletes versus astronauts. Athletes usually use one arm more than the other, and so the bone will be larger. While astronauts, after spending extended periods of time in outer space, will lose significant muscle and bone mass because of the lack of a mechanical force on their muscles and bones in zero gravity. So they actually lose muscle mass. They also lose bone mass, right? Bone remodeling. So that's the biomechanical functions, physiological functions of the bone. Now we need to talk about, the last thing we need to talk about is how do we talk about bones? How do we describe bones and discuss them? And it's going to be very, very important for you guys to know going forward. So we split up the body into two sections. The skeleton is divided into two parts, our axial skeleton and our appendicular skeleton. So our axial skeleton is comprised of all the bones that are along the midline or the central axis of the body. So this is the bones of the cranium, the mandible, the rib cage, and the vertebral column. Then you have your appendicular skeleton. And the appendicular skeleton is comprised of all the bones of the appendages, your arms and your legs. This includes the bones of the arm, the wrist, the hand, as well as the bones of the leg, ankle, foot. Importantly, bones that are considered to be a part of an appendage, or bones are considered to be a part of an appendage if they are essential to the function of that appendage. What does this mean? It means that there are some bones that appear to lie on the central axis, right? It looks like they are on the central axis, but they're actually considered part of the appendicular skeleton, right? So we're talking about the pelvis, the hip. You think about it, it looks like it's right on the axial skeleton, right? It's right down the midline of the body. But the hip bones are actually part of the axial skeleton, right? Because the primary function of the pelvis is to act as an area of muscle attachment for your leg muscles, i.e. an appendage, your legs, appendicular skeleton. Another example I'll give is your scapula, right? Your shoulder blades, what sticks out, those little wings you have, right? Those are considered appendicular because it's essential to that movement of your arm and your shoulder joint, right? So these two bones, your scapula, your hip bones, are primarily involved with muscle attachments for your legs and your arms, right? The stability. So it makes them part of that appendicular skeleton. So for ease and visualization, we have this skeleton who is color-coded to show you what is axial and what is appendicular. Axial, again, is along that midline of the body. Appendicular is our appendages, right? So now we have that taken care of. How do we talk about bones and describing them, right? I'm not going to say like rib this versus rib that, because everything has directional terminology, right? Everything, every time we describe a bone, right, it is in relation to another bone, right? It is in relation to another part of the body if it's not a bone, right? It can be like, you know, adjacent to the heart, lateral, medial, you know, dorsal, ventral, those kinds of things, right? And I will explain them. It'll make sense. Directional. So we describe the body first, axial versus appendicular. We can also describe the location and positions of the bones and other bony parts or features using directional terminology, right? So you are going to be getting like parts and features of bones, and you're going to be looking at them and seeing them and understanding that they are, you know, different, right? The distal end of your humerus is different than your proximal end of your humerus, right? And there's little features on them that make them different, right? Those features are essentially, they're going to be clues to help you determine what bone it is. All right, so first is superior and inferior. Superior and inferior are used to refer to the relative positions along the central longitudinal axis of the body in the anatomical position. Now you might be saying, well, Professor Noxie, what is anatomical position? This is not anatomical position specifically because the cranium is turned. It is turned to the side, right? Anatomical position is facing forward, head facing forward with the palms facing forward as well. Arms down, palms facing forward. That is anatomical position, right? So if this cranium was turned our way, facing us, it would be an anatomical position, right? The thumbs are on the lateral side, the medial sides are your pinkies, right? His cranium would be facing us. This is not anatomical position because his head is not facing us. So superior, inferior, right, is relative along the central longitudinal axis of the body in anatomical position. So superior is up, inferior is down, right? Don't say up or down, use superior and inferior. Then we have, bones that are superior are located higher on the axis. Bones they're higher than bones that are inferior. So again, you're going to say something like the cervical vertebrae is superior to the thoracic vertebra, right? Or the patella is inferior to the femur, something like that, right? So that's how we're going to be talking from here on out, right? Then we have medial and lateral. Medial and lateral are used to refer to positions relative to the midline of the body, but they are different from superior and inferior, right? So superior was up, inferior was down, medial is in the middle, lateral is to the side, right? Any direction to the side. So, and I have this one to help us out, but I don't want to get there yet. All right, so with medial and lateral, the focus is on what is closer or further from the central axis. Medial refers to being closer to the midline. Lateral is farther from the midline, more to the side, right? Then we have proximal and distal, right? They're used to refer to positions relative to the midline of the body, but their real emphasis is used on the trunk or away from the trunk, right? Being towards the trunk, away from the trunk. So you really, I tend to use proximal distal mostly with our appendages, right? I don't really like to use it with like an axial skeleton because it just gets confusing for you guys. Then we have, proximal is the end nearest to or in greatest proximity with the trunk. The distal end is the end that is farthest, most distant from the trunk. So if I'm talking about, say, the tibia, and I will say something like the condyles, the tibial condyle, the medial condyle of the tibia, right, is located at the distal end of the tibia. What I mean is that inner ankle bone, right, lateral of the distal end of the tibia. Really easy. So the shoulder end of the humerus, or the upper arm bone, is the proximal end, right? And the elbow would be the distal end, right? Then we have anterior and posterior. These are used to refer to the sides of the body. So I think of it as anterior referring to the front, posterior to the back, right? Anterior. I think in Spanish, so I think antes before, and then posterior in the back, but whatever works for you. So an anterior surface of a bone is a surface that faces the front of the body, and the posterior is the surface that faces the back. In the case of vertebrates or animals, we also have the terms dorsal and ventral, and these refer to the sides of the body. So dorsal refers to the back and ventral to the belly side. So in this case, I think of whales and I think of that dorsal fin that whales have on their backs. That's the dorsal side, right? Dorsal and ventral, when we're talking about humans, is synonymous to anterior and posterior. So again, right, superior up, inferior down, medial is closer to the midline, lateral is moving away from the midline, proximal is closer to the trunk, distal is away from the trunk, right? And then lastly, dorsal ventral. Dorsal ventral is synonymous to posterior anterior in humans, but if we're talking about an animal, right, which we will be talking about primates, dorsal means the back side, right, the spinal side, right, and ventral means the belly side, right, and posterior then would be the hind legs area, anterior would be the front, right? So that's just something to keep in mind for later on, right? So now we have to distinguish bone shapes. So there are 4 different shapes: long, short, flat, irregular, right? I believe that is the last thing, no, second to last thing we have to cover. We'll start with long bones. Long bones are made up of a central shaft with the distinct, slightly larger ends on each side. So central shaft, larger ends on each side. The long bones, the joints, and associated muscles work together to help the arms and legs achieve their maximum potential when engaged in daily activities. Having longer muscles in the arms and legs allows for a greater range of motion, and these longer muscles require longer bones for support and extension. So while bones like the femur, which is what we have here, are measurably long and large, not all long bones are large. So some examples of long bones that are not large are the bones of the hands and the fingers. They're considerably smaller than the femur, yet they're considered long bones because they have a central shaft and 2 ends that are slightly larger. So during growth, the ends of the long bones are your epiphyses have growth plates, and they separate the ends from the shaft, and they allow then that bone to grow in length until the end of puberty. That's why this is also known as the diaphysis. This is the epiphyses, 2 sides. Right. Then we have short bones. They, again, so really quick before I talk about short bones, you can see here the long bones of the finger, right? They have the central shaft and they have the 2 slightly larger ends, right? The epiphyses. Right, so short bones. Short bones don't have a clear shaft. Instead, they're more cube-like in shape with similar width and length dimensions. Often you'll find your short bones in compact areas, and the presence then of multiple tightly packed short bones limits that range of motion in that area. So you can think of the bones of the wrist, your carpals, they're classic short bones. So we can move our fingers a lot, right? Those joints. You can move your metacarpals here, right? These are your phalanges. You can't actually move these carpal bones, right? There's very little range of motion down here. You can move these, your metacarpals. You definitely can move your phalanges. You hardly can move your carpal bones. Okay. Next, we have our flat bones. The flat bones are thin plate-like bones. They make up a small proportion of the bones in the body. They have a layer of trabecular bone that is sandwiched between the 2 thin layers of flat cortical bone. So there's a little bit of trabecular bone there. They may serve as broad areas for muscle attachment, like we see here in the shoulder blade or the scapula, right? Or it can work as plate-like protection for delicate structures like the bones of the skull or the cranium, right? Then we have irregular bones. Right? Irregular bones are just any bones that don't readily fit into any of your other 3 categories, right? Of long bones, short bones, flat bones, right? They have complex and varied shapes, as we can see here with the bone of the spine, right? Of the vertebra. Any distinguishing bones, how do we distinguish bones? There are several features that we can use to distinguish them aside from that shape, right? Marks and features. So bone is a responsive tissue, so it's influenced by your surrounding tissues. Things like changes in your attaching muscles will leave marks on the skeleton. So each bone will have slightly different markings depending on how it relates to and interacts with your other nearby tissue. We can then use those markings, those bone features, to help us further identify specific bones. So when we're looking at bones, there are numerous specific types of bone features, but we will, for the purposes of this class, focus on 3 major types. And I say 3 knowing that this one has 3 here and this one has 2, but they're just kind of general categories. The first is projections. The second is our depressions, fossae, and grooves. And then our third is our foramina and canals. So projections. Projections are areas of bone that stick out from the rest of the bone surface. Right here we have this sagittal crest here that we can see. Projections will vary in size and usually serve as sites for muscle and tendon attachment. So here is a sagittal crest on this male gorilla here, right? It's an extra ridge of bone that runs along the midline of the cranium of some primates, and it allows the attachment of extra large chewing muscles. So these extra large chewing muscles, because our male gorilla here is a folivore, right? They attach to the sagittal crest, they go through the zygomatic arch, and they attach here to the mandible, right? They need those extra large chewing muscles for the sheer amount of chewing that they practice in a day, right? Then we have depressions, fossae, and grooves. These are indentations on the bone surface that often accommodate nerves, blood vessels, muscles, or other structures, right? Here we're looking at the iliac fossa in the pelvis. So this is a large indentation. It's on the anterior of the ilium. So this is the surface that faces forward, right? Anterior of the ilium, which is your upper bone of the pelvis, right? This accommodates your iliac muscle, which attaches in this area, right? So depressions, fossae, grooves. Then we have foramina and canals. And so these are holes in the bone, right? Foramina, right, is multiple. Foramen is singular. These are usually simple holes, while canals are often narrow tubular channels in the bones. These are like tunnels. These holes in the bone are usually associated with nerves or vessels. And so the one that is most well known, right, or one that I can probably guarantee that you know, is the foramen magnum. And this is the large hole at the base of the cranium, and it allows the brainstem to connect to the spinal cord. So you can see here, right, is foramen magnum. As you can see, here, there are many other foramina here that will accommodate nerves, right, that go into your facial nerves specifically, right? There's a lot of foramina here, but for the most part, it's the foramen magnum, right? And that's it. That is an introduction to the skeleton. Again, lots of stuff to know, but it's all very straightforward and very, very logical. Just think of your skeleton. Just think of the purpose of the bone, what it's for, and know that as you go through the next chapter, Lab 6, and you're starting to memorize the bones, really get a feel for them and understand how they move and how they function, because that'll really, really help you memorize those bones. Like I said, I didn't know them my first semester teaching this lab. By the end of that lab, I was a pro, right? So definitely just take your time. And this is what I did. I took my time. I went and I really got to know those bones, and not the muscles, but the bones, and how they moved and how they functioned and what was their purpose. And it really helped to understand that part.